Hi, I'm Scott Mitchell from the Silver River Museum, and here at the museum we are excited about history. There are lots of different ways to learn about Florida history, and in your classroom you're probably used to seeing secondary resources. Things like books or studies weekly. But here at the Silver River Museum we have lots of primary resources which to me are a little more interesting. Here are a couple of examples. The prehistoric Native Americans in Florida left clues like this artifact. This is a spear point or a knife. It's a great example of a primary resource. This was made by the person who lost it, so it's a direct link to the past. Here's a piece of a broken bottle that would have been used by a pioneer or a settler in the 1800s. And here is a very rare, wonderful example of a primary resource. This is an actual document written by a Spanish explorer in the late 1700s, and this is the real thing. This would have been written with a quill pen that they dipped in ink before they invented modern pens and paper. So if you have a chance to come to the Silver River Museum, be prepared to see lots of primary resources, things like artifacts and old historical documents, where you can go right to the source of the information, that is the people that left that information behind or wrote down what they saw. Here we have a collection of objects from an interesting person in Florida's past. I'm going to describe them to you, and I want you to make some observations and inferences as to who you think might have used them and what the objects were used for. So the first thing that really catches my eye is this big metal helmet with a cloth pad that goes up inside of it so that it was a little more comfortable to wear. But this is a steel metal helmet that you would wear on your head for protection. Now, why would you need a helmet? We also have some everyday objects like this green glass bottle. It has a little emblem here and a cork to keep the liquid inside. We have a wooden bowl and cup and a spoon made from cow horn. We also have a candle to provide light, and also a little cone-shaped object that looks like it might be used on top of the candle for some reason. And we have a feather with some black stuff on the end, and a brass container with some liquid inside. An old document, looks like it might have been written in the old-fashioned way. And we have a bag to carry all these smaller objects in, almost like a backpack or a knapsack. And then we have a smaller bag. We've got some glass colored beads. Let's see what's in the bag here. Oh, very old coins. This looks like gold and silver, and they're stamped with funny patterns that have crosses and crowns and things like that on them. Who do you think would have carried all these things in Florida's past, and what would they have done with all this stuff? Think about this and see if you can come up with some ideas. So now that you've had some time to talk about these objects, you may have come to the conclusion that these were used by a Spanish explorer, maybe even a Spanish soldier. The reason I say soldier is because of the military helmet. Everyday Spanish settlers would not have worn helmets like this. This was worn by a soldier or a conquistador during the early days of Spanish exploration in Florida, thinking like starting in the 1500s on through the 16 and 1700s. The Spaniards wore helmets, or at least the soldiers did, to protect their heads if they got into a fight with other soldiers from another country that they were fighting with over Florida. The Spanish and the French and the British all fought wars for control of the New World in places like Florida. So we also have a green glass bottle. This would have been used to carry water or perhaps other drinks. And if you lived in a house, you needed a place to keep your liquids, or if you were traveling, you might carry this in a wagon so that you could carry your drinks with you. Notice that the bowl and the cup are made from wood and cow horn. These are old-fashioned, hardy, they don't break easy. If you drop them, they're not going to shatter like ceramics. So this could be kept by a soldier as well. Now, this would have been a way to provide light. When the sun went down, you could light your candle, and this is a candle snuffer. So when you're ready to go to bed, you would simply put it over and extinguish the flame on the candle. And when you were walking to your bed chambers, you might carry it this way, almost like a flashlight. This is before electricity. Here is another old-fashioned version of something we still use today. This is a goose feather, but it's been turned into what we call a quill pen. Quill is another name for a long, hollow shaft of a feather. And this would have had black India ink. You can see a little bit of ink on the end of the pen. You would dip the pen into the ink and then use it to write on the paper. And in fact, this old document is from 1777, and it was written with a pen just like this. And you can see how the lines are thick in some places and thin in other places. And that is because these quill pens did not produce a uniform straight line like modern pens. Now, the Spanish explorers would have encountered Native Americans, people like Timucuan Indians, and sometimes they might have fought with those Timucuans, and sometimes they might have traded with those Timucuans. The Native Americans loved glass trade beads. They were more colorful and lasted longer than beads made from shell or bone or rocks. So the Timucuans loved to get glass trade beads. These are Spanish glass trade beads. And finally, the gold and silver coins. If this was a Spanish soldier, they would get paid from the King and Queen of Spain for being a soldier. And that's how they would pay their bills. So gold and silver would have been paid to the soldiers, which would have kept it in a little purse and carried it in their knapsack and kept it for safekeeping. We know that the Spanish settled in St. Augustine in 1565, and I mentioned that they did not get along with the British. So the British actually attacked St. Augustine in 1702, and we have a wonderful account from the governor of Florida to the King of Spain about the British attack in 1702. And this is titled The Siege of St. Augustine by Governor Moore of South Carolina in 1702, as reported to the King of Spain by Don Joseph de Zuniga y Cerda, governor of Florida. So this is what the governor of Florida wrote in 1702 after the attack. He says, "Sir, on the 22nd of October of the past year, Your Majesty was advised of the news that the enemy in Carolina, the British, was preparing to attack this place in the spring with numerous vessels by sea and troops by land. Their design was to capture this royal fortress. For this purpose, they brought on vessels assault cannons serving balls of 10 and 12 pounds and a quantity of tools for attacking and trench building with 15 25-foot ladders, as well as 400 Englishmen to be landed and 80 sailors as a protective force. They were attacking the fort at St. Augustine. I decided to gather together and protect all of the priests and friars and all of the women and children of the Spanish and Indian families, which kept increasing till there were in excess of 1,500 persons who entered the fort without adequate supplies. The soldiers would have had some food in the fort, and there was also a deep well dug in the floor of the fort where they could get fresh water. We know from these primary sources that the Spanish hid in the fort, and the British actually burned the entire town, but they could not get inside the fort. So after a few weeks, the British gave up and left, and the Spaniards came out of the fort and rebuilt St. Augustine. You can still go to the fort in St. Augustine today and see what it looks like, and there are even some holes in the walls of the outside of the fort left over from the British cannonballs that were fired at it. Here we have a set of objects that are very old, and they're unusual in the sense that everything here is made from materials that you would find in nature, like bone or rock or plant fibers or clay or wood. Well, let's look at them and I will describe them to you. So the first thing we have is a set of containers. This is obviously a wooden bowl. It looks like it's hand carved. It doesn't look like it's made on a machine. So we have a carved wooden bowl. We have these containers They look like they're made from clay. They also look like they may have been burned, and they're kind of decorated on the outside. Over here we have some unusual objects. This is made from a couple different materials. This looks like a bone, and this is a sharp piece of rock, and it looks like it's been tied into place and glued with maybe some leather or sinew. Here we have some more bones, but these are carved in very delicate, decorated patterns, and they almost look like fancy chopsticks. And here's a piece of shell that's also been carved. Has a hole in the middle, and then a couple of holes up here where it can be hung from some string or a piece of leather. It looks like we have some things made from leather. These are a matching pair. I wonder what these would be used for. Here's actually a big piece of leather. It's nice and soft, and it's inside a basket that looks like it's made from fibers that you would find from a palm tree here. It looks handmade as well. And this is what I think is a dried gourd with some netting to maybe carry it. And it's hollow inside. So all of these things are made with material that you can find in nature. They're very, very old, and there's nothing modern in this group. Who do you think would have used these objects? These were objects that were used in everyday life by prehistoric Native Americans in this part of Florida. And we know from primary resources from the very earliest Europeans that came to Florida, the Spanish explorers, that these people were referred to as Timucuan Indians. Timucuan Indians were farmers, and they lived in villages, and they also hunted and fished. And they used canoes, and they had villages along rivers and along the coast. And they were the group of people that were living here in Marion County in the early 1500s when the very first Spanish explorers came. But they had lived in this part of Florida for thousands and thousands of years. They didn't have modern materials like metal or glass, so they had to make everything that they wanted to use from things that they could find in nature. A wooden bowl, for example, carved with probably stone tools. This would be used to transport food or serve food or store things. A bone handle with a stone knife made by hand for cutting up food or wood or fibers to make basketry. And these objects are particularly ingenious. We've all worked with clay, or maybe Play-Doh when you were really little. Well, these are clay pots made from clay that is found just in the ground, maybe along a riverbank, and they're formed into pottery and fired in a campfire to make them hard so that they last, and you can even boil water and cook food in pots like this. They're also decorated on the outside to make each one a little bit unique. These would have been valuable objects if you could not go to the store and buy metal pots and pans. Now we talked about these fancy bone objects, which are in fact bone hairpins. Now I don't have long hair, so it won't work, but if I did have long hair, I could put these in the back and wear them as decorative objects. The early explorers actually made sketches and paintings of the Timucuan Indians, and in some of those primary sources, the Native American men and women are actually wearing bone hairpins as jewelry. So these are basically jewelry, as is the shell disc. In the images, some of the people have shell discs that are worn around their neck as necklaces. So these are basically prehistoric jewelry items. Now, nobody wants to run around barefoot and get splinters in their feet. These are shoes. They're made from thick leather, deer hide, and they're called moccasins today. But these are basically homemade shoes made with buckskin, which is another name for leather from the skin of a deer. And again, you couldn't go to the store and buy things, you had to make them yourself. Now, I mentioned earlier that they were farmers, and they raised things like corn, beans, and squash. Well, this is a dried gourd. It's kind of like a pumpkin in a way. And you dry it and you hollow it out, and you can use it to transport water. It's like a canteen. You can also eat gourds. And finally, this big thing here is basically a homemade basket to carry all of your things. Or if you're going out into the woods to collect acorns or firewood, you would use a basket to carry them back to the village. So these are objects that would have been carried by a Timucuan Indian or Native American that lived in Florida before the arrival of the first Spanish explorers. So this has just been a little sample of some of the primary resources that we have here at the Silver River Museum that make Florida history come alive. And Florida history is a fascinating topic because so many different groups of people have been here over the years. We have Native Americans, Spaniards, British, French, Americans, and all kinds of other groups coming and going, and sometimes getting along and sometimes not getting along. These are fascinating stories that make Florida what it is today. Now, when people write down their history in books, sometimes they leave parts out or maybe exaggerate other parts. But primary resources like old documents and the artifacts that were left behind by the people that created them tell the true story, and these are the most interesting clues. The Silver River Museum is full of interesting, fascinating primary resources, and we hope that you can visit the museum one day soon to do some investigations of your own and learn about Florida history through the objects we have here at the museum.